What's up, everybody? I'm Katie, and this is For Your Misinformation, a podcast dedicated to making politics more accessible for everyday Americans. My goal is to empower people, especially women, to become more politically engaged so we can act in our own best interests. Let me identify the problem and tell you exactly how we can solve it. On Mondays, I break down topics like voter suppression, impeachment, and white supremacy, look to the experts in that field, and then talk about the ways we can help the most. That might be donating to a charitable organization, voting in a local election, going to a rally, following activists on social media, running for office, or whatever else we can think of. On Wednesdays, I highlight individual politicians, whether I support them, and who you might want to vote for instead. If you take one message away from this episode on journalism and media literacy, I hope it's that journalism is meant to empower the public with truthful information. That's the goal, to investigate and report. That's why Donald Trump doesn't like journalists or the news media. Just like Congress has checks that balance the president's power, journalism that is rooted in fact, it also acts as a check on Trump, and we need it now more than ever. Media literacy basically means being able to tell whether something is legitimate or whether it's fake news. I'm not sure if I'm the best person to tell you this because truthfully, I fell pretty hard for an Onion article once in my early 20s, but I think I've grown since then. So it's important to be media literate because to engage in a digital society, we need to be able to understand, inquire, and think critically. It's important to effectively access, organize, analyze, and evaluate messages. This is probably a good time to define misinformation. Misinformation is false or inaccurate information, especially that which is deliberately intended to deceive. Trump specializes in misinformation in that he is constantly deliberately trying to deceive us. It's gaslighting. Media literacy helps us cut through the misinformation to get to the truth. Another message I hope we all hear loud and clear is that you have to work hard to find good journalism, and a lot of the time you have to pay for it. It's good to pay for your journalism to support journalists, especially progressive local ones. The quality of journalism in the United States is declining right now. I talked about one of the reasons for this decline in an earlier episode about white supremacy. It's not easy to find the truth these days, and that works to Trump's advantage. You can't just automatically trust what you see in the headlines of the New York Times or the Chiron on your local news. And keep in mind that editorials and opinion pieces are just that, someone's opinion. You have to make sure you're centering marginalized voices and experts and those who are actually seeking the truth. Just like there are good politicians who are in politics for the right reasons, there are journalists who are really seeking the truth out there. I'll list some good ones later. So remember, you should be getting your news from a wide variety of sources. Journalism is really important, and if it's possible for you to subscribe to your local newspaper or a reputable national newspaper, that's awesome. I subscribe to the New York Times and the Washington Post, which I chose because they lean pretty progressive, and that's what I want to support. I choose to get push notifications when important stuff happens. Aside from a few far right-wing publications that I don't even want to give name recognition to, your media diet is probably fine as long as you're getting your news from a couple different places and supplementing it with good journalists. I have problems with getting your news from traditional outlets and not supplementing it with good journalists. First, now, I'm not saying everything the New York Times writes is good. Honestly, I have some problems with a lot of their pieces, but I think it's better to support flawed journalism than none at all. Plus, if you subscribe, then you get access to the crossword puzzles. For real though, even the more progressive media outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post are not conveying the urgency that is necessary in this current situation. It is not an exaggeration to say that Trump is a threat to our democracy. I understand this because since 2016, I've been reading lots of books on the topic, and I follow investigative journalists, political activists, and policy experts on social media, particularly ones who've worked in U.S. intelligence like Malcolm Nance or studied authoritarian regimes like Sarah Kendzior and Andrea Chalupa. You should do this too, in addition to subscribing to a local and/or national newspaper. Plus, it's free. Make an effort to follow more activists for causes you believe in and the investigative journalists who report on it. Another problem that you have to be aware of is that journalism skews towards the perspective of wealthier white men because that's who increasingly ends up being the journalists at reputable organizations. Degrees from prestigious organizations cost money, and it's generational wealth that allows young adults to participate in unpaid internships that get them the jobs at the reputable organizations where they interned for free. Historically, privileged white men aren't the best at spotting oppression, and if you don't see it, you can't report on it. That means we have to overcorrect for that bias and make sure more women, people of color, LGBTQ+, and disabled people show up in our feeds. I've been making a conscious effort to do this over the last couple of years since Trump has been elected, and I can tell it's made a lot of positive changes to my perspective. It's also important to figure out who the experts are and listen to them, not to your uninformed uncle at Thanksgiving. So that's a really good place to start. Here are some of my favorites. I like Parker Malloy, Ronan Farrow, Malcolm Nance, Sarah Kendzior, Andrea Chalupa, Lauren Duca, Laverne Cox, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Adi Barkan, Olga Lotman, Natasha Bertrand. Some good publications to follow are Vox, Slate, The Guardian, Daily Kos, The Nation, and The Chicago Reader. I picked The Nation and donated $15 to help fund their investigative journalism today. Also, follow your local and state reps on social media if you haven't already. If you don't know who they are, just Google it. If you live in Illinois, your senators are Dick Durbin and Tammy Duckworth, who are both very cool. You'll have to look up your own House rep, but mine is Dan Lipinski. Have I mentioned that he sucks lately? So when you're consuming the news, ask yourself, how do they say they know this? From there, you can find the original sources and look to the original reporting before reading a story that might shape your view. An example of a good aggregator of these unbiased sources is Nowhere News, and that's Nowhere with a K, Knowhere, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. We should also think critically about the individual journalist's position and possible motives. Why did they choose to write it this way? Like I said, you have to work hard to find journalists that you trust and respect. Another thing I want to address, because I've been hearing it here and there lately, is this. I know that sometimes as a woman or a young person or both, you can often be belittled in politics, but remember, the only thing you need to express an opinion is to be informed. And if you're listening to this, you're way more informed than most people. Don't let people shut you down because of your age or your gender or anything else. But back to Nowhere News. They have a really, really good daily news briefing that is always verified. They are 100% transparent about all their sources, so you can check right there to see if it's credible, which it always is, or else they wouldn't include it. They also provide context that allows you to build your media literacy and learn how to interpret facts. They show you how bias manifests as you read, so people should learn how to spot bias better based on the context that they provide as they read more of it. It's pretty cool. And if you want to call them out if they are biased, you can send them an email and Scott will respond. The Chicago Reader is also really good. Like I mentioned earlier, I pay for a subscription to the New York Times and the Washington Post, even though sometimes I'm disappointed by their reporting. One of the best ways to access good journalism for free is to follow your favorite journalists on social media. I will highlight a bunch of these guys in my Instagram posts at FYMI pod on Instagram and Twitter. But here again are some of my favorite journalists, activists, and all-around people. Natasha Bertrand, Sarah Kendzior, Malcolm Nance, Rachel Maddow, Chris Hayes, Lauren Duca, Hassan Minhaj, Andrea Chalupa, Jon Stewart, John Lovett, Parker Malloy, Ronan Farrow, Andrea Chalupa, Lauren Duca, Laverne Cox, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Adi Barkan, and Olga Lotman. So follow some of them or all of them. Most of them are pretty funny. Donate to the Chicago Reader or find a newspaper or other local journal of your choice. And subscribe to Nowhere News. As always, keep listening to this podcast, and if you like it, please subscribe, rate, and review. iTunes reviews and in-person recommendations go a long, long way. Thank you! Shout out to Hope Dye for the podcast art, Kyle Dibdahl for the intro and outro music, and Ben Schlofelt for the audio production. I'd like to thank Lauren Duca, Sarah Kendzior, Andrea Chalupa, Brene Brown, Lizzo, AOC, Nancy Pelosi, Karen Kilgariff, Georgia Hardstark, Marie Newman, and my mom for their inspiration, and I'd like to thank you for listening.